So, fine. Definitely in 2 minutes.
Okay. Any more seats up here?
Now, for one, you can just bring the audio to the they can ask questions.
Okay, so you can make your right now.
No, no, no. I'll let you know when
Yeah, I'm gonna give it just another minute for Brownsville.
when you will see it when Brownsville is connected. You're gonna see it. You're gonna see it.
There's some seats back here.
You'll see your video and then
You see us in? There's a seat here. There's some seats over here. Okay, if we don't connect shortly, we'll just go ahead and start. Although I'm sure everyone here is enjoying this awkward.
Do you want the folks in Brownsville see the PowerPoint?
No, but what
Just audio. You can like verbally explain. I'm
so what I
graphing
need
it.
to tell them is that they can connect this link.
Oh, okay. For the YouTube.
disconnected because there's no people in the room.
Okay.
Okay, you can start.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Finally, welcome. It's really exciting to see all of you here and to see such a packed house, especially with so many amazing events going on for Hispanic Heritage Month right now. So thank you for coming. So I'm Dr. Catherine Medela-Watson, and I'm an assistant professor over in Literature and Cultural Studies. I'm also affiliate faculty in Moss, and I'm the co-director of Gender and Women's Studies. And so this is part of a small speaker series that we will be hosting this year that brings together various diverse voices around issues related to gender and women's studies. And so, of course, our first speaker this year is Dr. Grant Walsh-Haynes. I'm going to keep this very short. I just want to say thank you as well to the Office of Interdisciplinary Programs and Community Engagement, as well as the Political Science Department for hosting this event with us. So let me go ahead and introduce the speaker.
Okay, it's on.
Okay.
On, but like I said, nobody's here.
Okay.
All right.
So in case of you will have any friends who are not able to make it to this event, on the flyer, if you look up on YouTube, GWS Log Cabin Republicans, your friend, whoever's not here, can live stream it on YouTube and I believe watch it afterwards. that is another thing that I want to mention before I introduce our speaker. Please be aware that this is being live streamed to YouTube, and it'll stay on YouTube as video. And I'm letting you know that because after Dr. Walsh-Haynes' talk, there will be dialogue. So just be aware of that. So Dr. Grant Walsh-Haynes holds a PhD in political science from Northern Arizona University with a concentration in American politics and a specialization in interest group politics. He is currently a political science instructor at South Texas College, where he teaches federal government and Texas government. He has published works in American politics on interest groups and political party financing. He has also published on a range of queer or gay and lesbian topics such as hate crimes legislation, cybersexuality, and the recent same-sex Supreme Court case I'm going to, which is Obergefell versus Hodge. Dr. Walsh-Haynes' work is interdisciplinary, and today he will talk about the role of the largest gay and lesbian Republican organization, the Log Cabin Republicans. So without further ado, let's welcome him.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. The title of my talk is based on my most recent research, and it's called Log Cabin Republicans and the Same-Sex Marriage Debate. To understand the interest group, the Log Cabin Republicans, I want to tell you a little bit about their history and where they came from. In California, in 1978, the Briggs Initiative, or Proposition 6, came into political conversation. At the time, Anita Bryant was spearheading a campaign called Save Our Children. And Proposition 6 had the intent of removing gay and lesbian teachers from schools under the umbrella of saving our children. Harvey Milk was one of the politicians during the time who was an opponent of Proposition 6 and did not want to remove gays and lesbians from classrooms because why would there be a need to? Interestingly, a group of gay Republicans found an unusual ally in former governor of California, Ronald Reagan. At the time, Reagan was starting his campaign to run for president, but was in between serving as governor of California and his presidency. And he supported gays in California and opposed Proposition 6. But he did so from a conservative angle. Reagan said, the reason we can't pass Proposition 6, we can't pass this policy to remove gays and lesbians from schools, is because this kind of legislation could be abused by students. What if a student got a bad grade on an assignment? They could say, well, it's not my fault, my teacher is gay, and then would have grounds to remove that individual from school. Ronald Reagan saw this as a slippery slope and took this conservative argument and said, no, we don't want to support Proposition 6. We want to oppose Proposition 6. Proposition 6 did ultimately fail, and out of this debate, the Log Cabin Republicans were born. An unusual bridge, or an unforeseen bridge between a gay and lesbian politics and a conservative politics was seen really for the first time in contemporary American history. A lot has happened since then, and I don't have time to tell you about all of the history of the Log Cabin Republicans, but I do want to use their words to explain what the Log Cabin Republicans believe. So I'm going to read a section of the text they produced called What We Believe. This section, I want to briefly introduce 5 frames that I use, or 5 ways of making arguments that I use to understand the Log Cabin Republicans and how they make arguments. The 5 frames I want you to listen for are conservatism, individualism, family, equality, and inclusion. These are the 5 big frames the Log Cabin Republicans use. Here is their statement, what we believe. We are loyal Republicans. We believe in limited government, strong national defense, individual liberty. Log Cabin Republicans represents an important part of the American family, tax-paying, hardworking people who proudly believe in this nation's greatness. We also believe all Americans have the right to liberty and equality. We believe we believe equality for LGBT Americans is in the finest tradition of the Republican Party. We educate our party about why inclusion wins. Opposing LGBT equality is inconsistent with the GOP's core principle. Again, so the words from the Log Cabin Republicans mission statement. Today, the Log Cabin Republicans are the largest national organization for gay and lesbian Republicans. They have chapters in 21 states, multiple chapters in Texas, as well as California and Washington. And lastly, they have the big national office in Washington, DC. When I first found the Log Cabin Republicans, early conversations I had about the organization always started with a puzzled look. I'd like to introduce some of these puzzles, and this is one way that political scientists think about the world as using this example of a puzzle. One is, the first part is a set of assumptions that I bring to my work and to my research. And that is a pretty strong argument to make today that sexual orientation minorities do not have full access to citizenship. And you might be thinking, but wait, same-sex marriage is legal now, okay? Yet there are a number of ways in which full citizenship is not necessarily granted to gay and lesbian citizens. And so the first bullet point there, I've listed marriage, comma, relationship and parental recognition. There is a case slated to be heard in the Texas State Supreme Court where a company said, we have a gay employee and we recognize the same-sex marriage that the gay employee has, but we're not going to provide them benefits because they're not a married couple. Okay, so there's a difference now we're seeing between recognizing licensure and then maybe providing the things that that licensure implies. That case is going to be heard by the Supreme Court in Texas this year. There are other gaps in access to full citizenship, including public accommodations. If you've been reading about gay cakes, we can talk about that during the Q&A. Inclusion in the military, particularly for transgender individuals, protection in housing, homophobic violence and bullying, and also transgender issues. Given that gays and lesbians don't have access to full citizenship, and in talking with both Log Cabin Republicans and people who are curious about Log Cabin Republicans, I also identified another puzzle, that the Log Cabin Republicans act somewhere in between this space of the Republican Party and gay and lesbian politics. For folks in Brownsville, the visual image on the screen has a big red circle on the left-hand side, and in that big red circle, it says the Republican Party. And there's a big blue circle on the right-hand side, and in that big blue circle, it says Gay and Lesbian Social Movement. And the overlap, that's kind of purplish, it's sort of a Venn diagram, and the overlap in between lists the Log Cabin Republicans. The CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, Conservative Political Action Conference that occurs every year, did not allow the Log Cabin Republicans a space to talk about gay issues until after fighting tooth and nail, the Log Cabin Republicans finally secured a literal place at the table of CPAC in 2016. The organization still operates at the outskirts of the Republican Party and is still sometimes alienated by the Republican Party, although they've made great progress in inclusion within the party. And I'm going to tell you a story that might surprise you from the other end. In Charlotte in 2017, the state chapter of the Log Cabin Republicans wanted to participate in the Charlotte Gay Pride Parade. And the Gay Pride Parade Committee said, no, you can't participate in the Gay Pride Parade. This is puzzling to me. This organization exists in the tense interstitial space between the Republican Party and broader gay and lesbian social movement. I'd like to briefly introduce some of my driving research questions. Those are, how do the Log Cabin Republicans navigate this space in order to increase equality and inclusion for gays and lesbians, which is exactly what their mission statement aims to do? How does the Log Cabin Republicans frame issues to influence public policy? I've already introduced 5 of those frames. And then finally, what explains how the Log Cabin Republicans developed those particular friends? These are the frames. These are those political science-y research questions that drive my work and my research. My research is interdisciplinary. I want to understand an interest group, the Log Cabin Republicans. And the interest group literature in political science does a great job of explaining how groups work. But it doesn't do a great job of explaining how gay groups work, or it doesn't really explain how the Log Cabin Republicans are going to exist in between the space of the Republican Party and gay and lesbian politics. So I also, when I was writing my theory section, I went shopping, right, for different theories that might help me explain the world, and I borrowed from science. I also borrowed ideas from intersectionality from women's gender studies, and then also some ideas of assimilation and liberation from gay and lesbian studies. By way of very brief introduction, intersectionality is a very helpful tool for understanding how multiple axes of oppression or marginalization interact to explain experience, okay? I'm seeing a few nods in the audience. And then I also wanted to think about something from gay and lesbian studies, this difference between assimilation and liberation. Again, very briefly, assimilation is how folks get a place at the table. Liberation takes a very different tact and says, maybe that's not the right table. Okay, maybe there's another better table that could recognize gay and lesbian experiences as their own at a different table. So I borrow from those major theories, making my work interdisciplinary. The methods I use draw from framing and case study methods, and I support my work with a series of elite interviews. I interviewed Log Cabin Republicans, in particular those with leadership positions in the organization. I'll be happy to discuss theory and method in more depth during the Q&A. The Log Cabin Republicans use a multi-pronged strategy to tackle this issue of same-sex marriage equality. So now we're back to the big picture topic of and the focus on same-sex marriage equality. And they use this multi-pronged approach to make or promote changes within all three branches of government. I'm going to talk in more depth about the advisory opinion that the Log Cabin Republicans and Dan Winslow filed with the Federal Elections Commission. The Federal Elections Commission is a part of, it's like almost like an administrative aspect of the executive branch. The Log Cabin Republicans filed amicus. An amicus brief is also called a Friends of the Courts brief. I'll explain that in more depth. And they, in other words, this interest group filed a supporting document during the Supreme Court case, Bergefell v. Hodges. And the last prong of the strategy was to target policymakers in the legislative branch, and they did that through press releases. A lot of my research involved reading through and analyzing press releases produced by the organization. Many of their press releases will name a specific policymaker and either support the ways in which they've supported gay and lesbian issues, or really challenge those policymakers if they've done something to work against inclusion for gays and lesbians. I want to talk in a little more depth about the ways the Log Cabin Republicans intervened with the executive branch. The Federal Elections Commission has had in its language something called a spousal exemption. Okay, a spousal exemption. Dan Winslow, I had the opportunity to interview Dan Winslow in 2016. Dan Winslow was a representative in the Massachusetts House of Representatives from 2011 to 2013. After he had served, he said, I want to do more with my political career, and he decided to run for Senate, and he ran against Kerry. There's a spoiler alert here. He didn't win. Okay, he didn't win. But in his process of running, he really ran as a Republican, but also a balanced fair-minded Republican, and he also boasted accurately that he had experience working in all three branches of government. So he had the credentials and the resume to run for this office. In his experience campaigning and raising money, he realized something that felt wrong to him. He realized that he could not receive political contributions from his gay and lesbian supporters in equal measure to the political contributions of his heterosexual supporters. Why? Because of the spousal exemption in a clause of the Federal Elections Commission. The spousal exemption says that if a married couple, with a marriage recognized by the state, if a married couple wants to contribute to a political campaign and one partner is working but the other is not working, that the partner who's working can contribute on behalf of the partner who's not working. Okay. We can all contribute $2,700 a year. That's the legal limit in federal elections. So a straight couple with one working partner can contribute $5,400 to a political campaign, according to this spousal exemption. The spousal exemption does not recognize same-sex marriages. So Mr. and Mr. or Mrs. and Mrs. same-sex partner cannot contribute in equal measure. Should one partner be working and the other not be working, that couple could only contribute $2,700 to a political campaign. Realizing this, Dan Winslow said, this is a problem. And it's a problem in the executive branch in the language of this spousal exemption in the Federal Elections Commission. So he worked with a team of lawyers to file something called an advisory opinion. An advisory opinion does not have the power of adjudication. It does not have the power of the court, but it is a strong, well-researched argument that can be made and handed to the executive branch. The first filing was denied outright because at the time, in the period after 1996 and before 2013, there was something called the Defense of Marriage Act. And the Defense of Marriage Act basically said that marriage could be between one man and one woman. That's the real quick version of that. So they filed this, Dan Winslow and his team filed this document with this advisory opinion with the Federal Elections Commission. It was denied outright because of the Defense of Marriage Act. Meanwhile, there was a court case going on called United States v. Windsor. Windsor was a surviving spouse, and her partner, that was a lesbian couple, and Windsor was the surviving spouse. In 2007, they were married in Toronto. In 2009, Spire, the partner, passed away and left an estate to Windsor, okay? She left an estate to Windsor, and then normally a married couple would get an exemption for this kind of thing. But instead, Windsor, the surviving spouse, was charged $363,000 in taxes to acquire the estate, okay? So they went to court, and actually it was the United States that brought her to court because she refused to pay. She said, I'm not gonna do that. Okay, and the United States took her to court. It went up to the Supreme Court, and ultimately that case dismantled DOMA, but it didn't really make same-sex marriage legal. Here's why. The decision that the Supreme Court made just said, well, we're just going to leave it to the states to decide what a legal union is. And at the time, New York State did recognize same-sex marriages. So while this United States v. Windsor thing was happening, Dan Winslow rewrote and filed again, challenging DOMA and this idea of the spousal exemption. Okay, and at this time in history, in 2013, things are starting to pick up around same-sex marriage. States are starting to pass same-sex marriage legislation or acts. Okay. To understand how Log Cabin Republicans intervened with the judicial branch, I'm going to tell you a little bit of case history for Obergefell v. Hodges. Obergefell v. Hodges is the case listed at the bottom of my slide here. That is de facto the case that legalized same-sex marriage. So if you've heard of this case and heard Obergefell v. Hodges, de facto, you are correct to say that that case legalized same-sex marriage. And it is more accurate to say that the result of Obergefell v. Hodges made it illegal for a state representative or a state to deny a same-sex marriage license, to deny a marriage license to a same-sex couple. Makes sense? There's a minor difference there with how the law works. This image comes from the Freedom to Marry campaign, which had also started at this time. And in the picture, the states Michigan, from north to south, states Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee are shown. Each of the states is colored in red, and each has a white heart inside of this. And I'm going to talk about 4 cases, and they're from Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. These are the 4 states in the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. The first case, DeBoer v. Snyder, the couple, April and Jane, were both living in Michigan. Both were registered nurses and the parents of 3 special needs adopted children. Okay? This is a family of 5, April and Jane, with 3 special needs adopted children, 1 boy and 2 girls. At the time, Michigan did not recognize same-sex marriage and so restricted second parent adoption unless the couple was married. April and Jane took the state to court. They said, that's not right. We want to have both of our names on the adoption paperwork for our 3 children. The lower court supported April and Jane. When the lower court supported April and Jane, they put what's called an injunction on the state and said the state can no longer deny you access to this right. The state immediately appealed the case to the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. In a 2-1 split decision, the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed the decision of the lower court and overturned the lower court's decision, maintaining Michigan's right to deny April and Jane access to putting their names on adoption paperwork. In the same year, Obergefell v. Kasich featured included 2 couples. The first, James or Jim Obergefell and John Arthur. They were a couple who were together for 20 years, and they could not get legally married in Ohio. John Arthur at the time had been diagnosed with ALS. ALS is also called Lou Gehrig's disease. I am not a medical professional, but my understanding of this disease is that it is terminal. There is no cure for ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, and basically means that the brain slowly stops talking to the muscles over time. Okay, so John Arthur was wheelchair bound when this case started, and they decided when Maryland passed same-sex marriage, they decided, despite great difficulty, to travel to Maryland to get married and to go and to return to Ohio. Why would they want to go to that great trouble? That they could put both names on John Arthur's death certificate. Okay. At the time in Ohio, that was not allowed. While this was happening, another couple, David Mishner and William Ives, a Delaware couple, were legally married and had 3 adopted children in Delaware. They traveled to Cincinnati, Ohio on vacation, where William Ives died unexpectedly of a heart condition. The funeral home that interred Ives' body refused to give his body back to his surviving partner, David Mishner. Why? Because at the time, Ohio did not recognize a same-sex union, and they could not fill out David's name under the spouse line on the death certificate. Okay. So they went to court. They took the case to court and they sued Ohio and said, this isn't right. We want to put both names of both partners on the death certificate. The lower court supported both of these couples and said, you're right, you should be able to put both names on the death certificate. The state immediately appealed the case, went to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and so the lower court put an injunction on the state, right, and said, no, the state, you can't do this, you've got to allow these couples to put their names on the paperwork. The state immediately appealed the case to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and in a split decision, a 2-1 decision, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals stayed the decision of the lower court and overturned the court's ruling. So they were not allowed to put their names on the death certificate. Okay? Moving on down the line here, Gregory Bork and Michael De Leon, couple in Kentucky, actually traveled to Ontario, got legally married, came back to Kentucky. At this time, the proverbial dominoes were falling, and we see states across the United States legalizing same-sex marriage. They come back to the state of Kentucky with license in hand. They join several other couples, and they sue the state of Kentucky. The lower court said, you know what? Kentucky should recognize your out-of-state license. We support you. The state and so what happened in the lower court is that they put an injunction on the state and said, the state, you have to recognize these same-sex marriage licenses. And the state immediately appealed the case to the Sixth Circuit in a split 2-1 decision. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals stayed the decision and overturned the lower court's ruling. If this is sounding like a familiar story, then it should. The dominoes are falling in this case too. That brings us to Tanko v. Haslam. Same thing, 3 same-sex couples filed against the state of Tennessee. Interestingly, the lower court used the ruling in Bork v. Bashir as legal precedent to support their decision for why same-sex marriage should be recognized in the state of Tennessee. The lower court supported the couples. They put an injunction, a temporary injunction on the state of Tennessee. The state of Tennessee immediately appealed the case to the Sixth Circuit in a split 2-1 decision. The Sixth Circuit stayed the decision of the lower court and overturned it. That brings us to Obergefell v. Hodges. Now there's a multi-state trigger and constitutional justification to move this case to the Supreme Court. Beyond that, all the way to the Supreme Court, okay? Beyond that, people are posting rainbow flags filters on their Facebooks, yes? And people are talking about same-sex marriage. They really hadn't years before that. This movement this case now, Obergefell v. Hodges, had something called ripeness. It was ripe for the picking and ready to be heard by the Supreme Court. That brings us to what the Log Cabin Republicans did in this case. The Log Cabin Republicans filed something called an amicus brief, a Friends of the Courts brief. Obergefell v. Hodges received a record-breaking number of amicus. Organizations for and against same-sex marriage filed, and we had never seen, I think it was 177 amicus. Okay, I'll get the right number for you if you're curious. Log Cabin Republicans, with their sister organization, the Liberty Education Foundation, filed one of those amicus briefs. Now, what I really want to emphasize about the amicus brief is that it wanted to take a conservative approach to appeal to conservative Supreme Court justices. So we're seeing rainbow filters on Facebook, and that's good and that feels right, yeah? And we're hearing things about human rights, good, and that feels right. And we're hearing things about love, okay? That these couples are in love and that's good and right. But as I hope I've demonstrated here, these cases aren't about love or religion or God really either. What are they about? They're about paperwork. Okay, they're about adoption paperwork. They're about marriage licenses and the recognition of those licenses, and adoption paperwork and death certificates. Okay, So the Log Cabin Republicans wanted to take a similar conservative tact to address and bring their issues to conservative Supreme Court justice in a way that was convincing. How did they do that? How did they navigate this interstitial space? What kinds of arguments could they make? Well, they had been working with Dan Winslow and this spousal exemption and the Federal Elections Committee stuff. And the real crux of the argument that the Log Cabin Republicans made in their amicus brief was about the need for same-sex marriage to allow for equality in political campaign contributions. They made the argument that unless same-sex marriage is allowed, opposite-sex couples have an advantage in the political system because, as we discussed before, they can contribute at twice the level to a political campaign as their same-sex counterparts. That's the argument the Log Cabin Republicans made for marriage equality. Okay. In reviewing the writings, the press releases, the amicus, I look at 5 frames, 5 ways that the Log Cabin Republicans make arguments and think about issues. And those 5 frames are conservatism, individualism, family, equality, and inclusion. What a conservative argument to make for the Supreme Court. An argument about political contributions. This was the biggest surprise and I would say one of the biggest findings in my research of the Log Cabin Republicans. I was very surprised at the argument and the way they framed this argument to appeal to conservative Supreme Court justices. They also use a frame of individualism, targeting and networking with individuals. A lot of the language in the press releases that they use focuses on that one individual and the behavior that that one individual took. I was also surprised that the family frame was silent, okay? And in thinking about it and analyzing why that would be, actually makes good sense. If I approach a Supreme Court justice and say, well, same-sex marriage should be allowed because we want to promote families, the first response would be, yeah, so that's why marriage should be between a man and a woman so they can reproduce and create a family. Yes? So rather than make an argument about family, I found the Log Cabin Republicans were really quiet on family in the documents that I reviewed and in the amicus. This isn't about same-sex marriage to promote family, it's about political contribution. Because if we start talking about family, before you know it, we might run up against some problems when trying to convince a conservative Supreme Court justice, for example, why same-sex marriage is just or the right thing to do. The Log Cabin Republicans did talk about and emphasize equality as a conservative value. One of the biggest findings here that I saw was they really didn't talk about equality as a human rights issue. Like people should have equal access to human rights. That's a lot of what we heard coming from the left. And so instead, they really talk about equality as a conservative value, okay? That having liberty and freedom from government is going to allow people access to equality. Different kind of framing around this idea of equality. And then lastly, their focus on political contributions is a way to include gays and lesbians in a political process. So they use this idea of inclusion through political contributions as a way to access full citizenship. I do have a few concluding remarks, but I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate your time and attention. I want to thank UTRGV, the Gender and Women's Studies program, the interdisciplinary programs and community outreach, the Office of, I think, and the Department of Political Science. I'd also like to thank Dr. Catherine Nova Watson. I appreciate your time working with me. Thank you very much. I just want to say one more thing, I think, about this. It's really cool to be visiting a space It's really cool to take some time and attention and have a safe space for queer scholarship. Okay, that's really cool from my perspective on this side of the podium, and I do really appreciate your time and attention on this particular topic. So thank you. I do have some concluding thoughts. A lot of times in conversations I have with folks about the Log Cabin Republicans, they'll say, well, does what they do matter? Or like, well, how many Log Cabin Republicans are there really? This is just one interest group in our political system. So in that way, it is a blip on the radar of American politics. So instead of asking a question about whether or not the organization is successful, if this little fish in a big ocean is successful, instead, I like to think about whether or not the way they framed their own arguments to promote their own strategy was effective. Was that successful? And I think overwhelmingly, the creativity and the courageous blend of conservative politics and gay and lesbian politics does make them very successful. I think the frames we talked about, the frame of conservatism, individualism, I think these really do draw out strong arguments that the organization makes, and they are convincing. And I hope that they were convincing to the Supreme Court justices, for example. As I was writing this presentation, I was also thinking about my own personal experiences, both in the academy and with this particular research, and how cool it is to, and what a place of privilege it is to be alive in 2019. And I really have been thinking a lot about how there's not one way to be gay. A lot of folks I talk to will say, well, gay Republican, it doesn't make sense. And more, I think, and want to communicate to you all that sexual orientation is not destiny in terms of political ideology. And because I've been studying this organization for so long, it almost seems like a silly notion to me at this point. Like, of course not all gay people have the same political ideology. And yet, we still do reinforce those ideas or those pairings that gays and lesbians should be liberal for these reasons. There's not one way to be gay, and that certainly includes political ideology. One of the theories I talked about at the very beginning of the presentation is intersectionality. One of my concluding thoughts, and hopefully as I continue to produce research related to this topic, something I can contribute to this idea of intersectionality is that often intersectionality helps us understand how two or more marginalized identities intersect and operate together, but we don't spend a lot of time looking at or evaluating how marginalized and privileged identities intersect and influence each other. And I think the Log Cabin Republicans offer a really interesting site where that kind of research and thinking can take place. How do categories that are associated with privilege around race, citizenship status, language status, class, intersect with maybe other categories of marginalization, in this example, sexual orientation? That's something I hope to have conversations with you all about and think more about as I continue working on this project. Much like the civil rights movement, which gave the right of voting to whites and to non-whites in particular, yes. The civil rights movement did not end racism. Of course not, okay, of course not. Similarly, the gay and lesbian social movement that promoted and ultimately, Obergefell v. Hodges, has made same-sex marriages legal. So gays and lesbians have now the right to get married. Did that end homophobia and transphobia? No, of course not. So by way of final thoughts, I just want to stress the importance of this. This is a really cool moment in gay and lesbian history, and having access to marriage matters because of all this paperwork stuff, death certificates and marriage licenses and adoption paperwork, and yet challenges lie ahead for homophobia, for transphobia, for a continued fight towards equality and full citizenship. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I have references if you have any questions about those. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. We do have about 10-15 minutes for Q&A, so I welcome you to ask questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm curious if we can discuss a little bit more the notion of intersectionality. Sure. Because one of the issues, or I guess critiques that have been raised against the Log Cabin Republicans and the whole notion of marriage in general, is that while it does advance rights of marginalized groups in some ways, it is also reinforcing heteronormative values of family and marriage. And so it's more about assimilation rather than liberation, to use the language you use.
Yes.
So I'm curious about how they navigate that, how Log Cabin Republicans, how diverse their group is and how room they have for these different forms of approaching citizenship and inclusion and politics.
Excellent. Thank you for your question. So one of the questions in your question is about diversity in the organization. I'd encourage you to take a look at their webpage, their board of directors. They have images up online. This is not a particularly diverse organization. Okay, this is an organization, at least in terms of leadership, that is mostly white men. Okay, and that is definitely important in understanding how identities intersect and operate together. Yes, that the privileged categories of race and ethnicity come together with the marginalized identities around sexual orientation. And that's where we are. In terms of the assimilation, liberation stuff, I want to talk about that again a little bit. Assimilation is this idea that comes from gay and lesbian studies about having access to the existing table. And liberation is flipping the table and saying, no, we need another table, or we need to be recognized in a different way. Marriage in and of itself is an extremely conservative institution. Yes, it's an institution that its primary purpose is social control. Okay. The Log Cabin Republicans are squarely in the assimilationist rather than liberationist camp in terms of gay and lesbian activism. Whether that's right or wrong, or good or bad, I will leave that to your own thoughts about what assimilation means and what liberation means. But the task of Log Cabin Republicans is conservative in that it is also assimilation. That, yes, we want recognition as normal married people who are just like our heterosexual counterparts. I'm not sure that I've answered all parts of your question, but this organization is squarely in that assimilationist side of politics and politicking. They are not trying to stir the pot or change the dynamic. They're reinforcing existing social structures like marriage. I did want to say one more thing I remembered now. There's an academic Poir who writes about the word just totally escaped my head. Who writes about homonationalism? Homonormativity and homonationalism. And is very critical. So my task here today was not necessarily to be critical of the Log Cabin Republicans, more to introduce some of their strategies and tactics, some of the ways they're thinking about the world. Poir and others would be very critical of this idea of promoting a westernized gay and lesbian institution in the globe, right? That being gay should look one way, that being gay should look like going to pride parades and getting married and having children. So is that the one way to be gay? Ooh, right? And that's part of what I'd like to stress now is that of course not. Of course there's not one way to be gay. So I'm thinking about Poir and homonationalism and homonormativity in that context.
As we see like a rise in transphobia and a lot of trans women getting attacked and stuff like that, I wonder what are there, because they're so, conservative and a lot of the trans hate is happening, you see, to more disproportionately to women, trans women of color. How for that group, how are they responding to that, or how are they trying to fight that fight?
Carefully, and like good conservatives, slowly. They've been very reserved in supporting a recent piece of legislation, the Equality Act. You've heard about the Equality Act. This is broad-based measures to protect individuals. It's in essence, in spirit, it's an addition to the Civil Rights Act and wants to include sexual orientation and gender identity to protections for citizens. And they've been careful to support that, much in the way that Reagan argued against Proposition 6. We don't want Proposition 6 in case students abuse that proposition and then accuse their teachers of being gay and get them kicked out. In the same way, they're being really careful and tentative about the Equality Act in case it were to be abused. They're thinking about how could a policy like this be abused in the future. The organization has shifted on trans issues, and in fact, just hosted an event. I'm not sure if you'll see the humor in this, but they called it the Tea Party, the capital Tea Party, which is a play on words of the Tea Party, which is an alt-right wing of the Republican Party. So they were hosting a Tea Party to raise awareness about issues and transphobia. So are they gonna be at the center of the fight when they're fighting the fight? I don't think so. I think they're gonna be careful and measured outsiders. And they have also brought in and embraced transgender issues, which I think even 10 years ago they really hadn't done. So they are moving forward incrementally, very slowly, very assimilationist in a more conservative way.
When I heard about this group, I can't remember, it was a while ago, the way they came off to me as white gay men wanting to keep the privilege of being white men, but still being able to be gay, but have all the privilege of being white men. So I felt like they didn't really embrace the other side of being, the rest of the letters, in the LGBT.
Sure, just being some of them. Sure. So I think that's a great observation, and I think it's thinking about intersectionality as how privileged and marginalized identities work together and operate together. Yeah. Great comment. Thank you for your comments.
I just want to add something sort of maybe that might be helpful for you and maybe use. So is this going to be a book? Is this your book project? Or a book project or an article?
I mean, not
Because-
today.
okay.
Articles and future publishing opportunities.
Because what stands out to me and what I find really interesting is that we're no longer talking about queerness, which is like the anti-normative, right? We're talking about, as you mentioned earlier, homonormativity and kind of like the taming of queerness and maintaining white supremacy and white privilege, right? And so, yeah, so what I find so interesting is this kind of like the taming of queerness and controlling of it. And it goes back to how you're sort of nuancing more our ideas about intersectionality and privilege.
So imagine that you were fighting to get a table at CPAC, okay? In that moment, the Log Cabin Republicans who were fighting for a seat at the table benefited and used their privilege as white men, oftentimes wealthy, those kinds of intersections of privilege. And those were the tools they were able to use to be present at CPAC, right? To talk to other Republicans at CPAC, to move other Republicans a little bit towards the middle on equality and inclusion for gays and lesbians. And the incrementalism, I can tell, is maddening. Okay, it's frustrating. But I see that as a part and parcel to how the Log Cabin Republicans are able to accomplish what they accomplish. Is there a space to be critical of that? Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm just wondering, when it comes to the political activism, is there a sense that LGBT issues are the priority above all other issues? or no. How that combines with the other aspects of conservatism that are supposed to be inherent to the group. Like for instance, in terms of endorsing a politician, right? And the litmus test and those things like that. Is that understood to be the defining, LGBT issues are the defining way in which politicians are evaluated or no? How do they balance those two things, or those many things?
Sure. As far as the Log Cabin Republicans operate as a watchdog organization of policymakers, that is the litmus test. Are they moving towards us on gay and lesbian inclusion, or are they moving away from us? And the organization, while I would say big picture, the center of this organization is gay and lesbian inclusion, they also are concerned about taxation and military and a number of other contemporary American political issues. And gay and lesbian inclusion is at the center of their organization.
You mentioned gay cakes, but you only said the term. You didn't actually said the definition.
I didn't explain gay cakes. So there have been some debates happening right now about public accommodations. And in the Texas state legislature this year, Texas supported the sincerely held religious beliefs of business owners. The debate has been whether or not a same-sex couple can walk into a cake shop and get a cake for their same-sex marriage, okay? And does a business owner with sincerely held religious beliefs have the right, the constitutional right, to deny that couple those services? So Texas came out this year and said, yes, we support business owners with sincerely held religious beliefs. This is a national conversation that's there was also a Supreme Court case that sort of ended the same way, but kind of left a space for question marks in the future. That's what I meant by gay cakes. So this is about public accommodations and whether or not gays and lesbians have access to businesses that can be denied service, and that's read as being denied service because of their sexual orientation.
Here's another thing with that. It's, you can see you talked about abusing certain, rulings and things like that. That same ruling, I know I saw a video. This lady refused to have an interracial couple at her hall or something like that, and she said it's against her religion, and use that same excuse. So how far can we take that?
It remains to be seen. The Supreme Court did make a decision. It was Cake Masterpiece Cake Shop, the Colorado Commission on Diversity, I think was the name of the Supreme Court case. And right now, cases are tending to side with religious freedom. But that's sort of a to be continued.
Also,
Real quick, we're gonna let her, and then you just.
yeah,
guys.
that's right.
Oh, I just wanted to know, what was the website again for the live stream? Because
Whatever it is. I'm gonna give you this flyer.
Oh, yes. It's because of all this, the presentation that you've been mentioning, it made me like think about something about the Stonewall incident. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. I mean, you may have or may not. I'm not sure, but what happened within that incident? Like, I know that something happened within New York City, but I'm not aware of how.
Sure. So that happened sort of before the history that I outlined. We are just at time. I think I'd rather talk to you about that afterwards, if you'd like to. But that's usually seen as the cornerstone for the beginning of gay visibility, and that was a moment in history that changed from gay invisibility to gay visibility and activism. So it was a very important moment in gay history, and the Obama administration did make Stonewall space a national monument.
Okay, well that concludes us. Real quickly, I do want to say, because we are a small but developing program, and if you enjoyed this talk and the discussion, we do have a gender and women's studies minor and certificate. So if you're interested in either, please look us up on the website, and me and my co-director will hang around afterwards. So say hello and ask any questions that you might have. But thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr. Washington.
Thank you.